The letter arrived at a farmhouse in Bavaria sometime in the autumn of 1944. The soldier who wrote it had survived the hedgerows of Normandy, the grinding retreat across France, and the chaos of a front that never seemed to hold. He had faced Sherman tanks, artillery barrages, and fighter bombers that owned the sky. But what he wrote home about wasn't any of those things. He wrote about a sound that came before anything visible arrived. A sound that made him feel it was already too late. German soldiers across multiple theaters of World War II kept writing about the same experience. In their letters home, their unit diaries, their debriefs with intelligence officers. They all circled back to the same American weapon. Not the tank, not the jeep, not even the legendary American logistics machine that kept armies fed across thousands of miles of supply lines. They wrote about the artillery. Specifically, they wrote about something American artillery did that no other army on Earth was doing at the same scale, with the same reliability, or to the same devastating effect. They called it time on target, and they couldn't explain how it was possible. To understand why German soldiers were so shaken, you have to understand what artillery combat normally looked like in World War II. Every major army used artillery. The Germans were excellent at it. The Soviets used it in terrifying concentrations. The British were highly professional. Artillery was the dominant killer of the war, responsible for more casualties than any other weapon system on any front. But there was a problem baked into the nature of artillery itself. When you fire multiple guns at a target, the shells don't arrive at the same moment. The first gun fires, its shell travels its arc, and it lands. Then the second gun fires, then the third. The target hears the first shell, and if they're experienced soldiers, which German veterans most certainly were, they're already moving. They're in ditches, behind walls, sprinting for cover. By the time the fifth or sixth shell lands, the area might be full of craters, but the men who were standing in it 30 seconds ago have scattered. Every army accepted this as a fundamental limit of artillery. The Americans decided it wasn't a limit at all. The idea behind time on target, sometimes abbreviated in military documents, but always spoken as the full phrase, was precise and almost elegant. Instead of firing guns in sequence, you calculate the flight time of every single gun in the fire mission. Each gun fires at a different moment. The gun with the longest flight path fires first. The gun closest to the target fires last. Every shell from every barrel, from every battery, possibly miles apart, arrives at the target within the same few seconds. The target doesn't hear one shell, then another, then another. The target hears everything at once. There's no warning. There's no time to move. There's no first explosion to signal that more are coming. The ground simply erupts in every direction simultaneously, and anyone standing in that zone has no recourse whatsoever. The mathematics behind this sounds simple. The execution was extraordinarily difficult. To pull it off, you needed precise knowledge of each gun's location. You needed accurate maps. You needed detailed ballistic tables for every type of shell, every powder charge, every muzzle velocity. You needed to account for wind. You needed to account for temperature, because cold air is denser and slows a shell slightly differently than warm air. You needed radio networks that actually worked, connecting forward observers to battery commanders to fire direction centers. And you needed every crew, at every gun, to execute their firing time with stopwatch precision. The Americans built all of this systematically, and they built it before the war. The Fire Direction Center was the nerve of the whole system. Before the United States entered the conflict, American artillery doctrine had already shifted toward centralized fire control. Rather than each battery commander selecting his own targets and managing his own fire, the Fire Direction Center collected requests from forward observers, calculated firing data for multiple batteries simultaneously, and coordinated fires across entire divisions and corps. Fort Sill, Oklahoma, the home of American artillery training, had been refining this system through the 1930s. By the time American units landed in North Africa in late 1942, the doctrine existed in mature form. What the early campaigns provided was a brutal real-world test, and the results of that test were not immediately glorious. At Kasserine Pass in February 1943, American forces took a serious beating from German armor and infantry. German commanders were dismissive. They reported that American artillery, while plentiful, was uncoordinated. Individual batteries fired independently. Communication between observers and guns was unreliable. The volume of shells was impressive, but the effect was manageable. German General Erwin Rommel had already formed his opinion of American fighting ability, and he was not complimentary. But the Americans were watching their own failures, just as carefully as the Germans were. General Leslie McNair, the architect of American ground force training, had been monitoring the North African campaign closely. The fire direction centers existed. The doctrine existed. The training had emphasized the system. What broke down was execution under real combat conditions. The radios that failed, the observers who misjudged positions, the crews who weren't yet fast enough under pressure. The Army fixed it. Not gradually, not slowly, with the specific, urgent energy of an institution that had identified exactly what went wrong and had the industrial base and training infrastructure to correct it, faster than any other army on Earth. By the spring of 1943, something had shifted. March 23, 1943. Dawn broke over El Guitar in Tunisia. The German 10th Panzer Division rolled forward, expecting to shatter an American infantry position. They'd done it before. American units had broken under armored pressure in the past, and German commanders had catalogued those breaks with professional satisfaction. What they drove into this time was different. The American 1st Infantry Division, the big red one, was dug in and waiting. Their artillery observers had pre-registered targets across every approach. Their fire direction centers were staffed and networked. When the German armor crossed into the kill zone, the request went back. The calculations ran in seconds, and the guns spoke, not one at a time, but together. The 10th Panzer Division lost over 30 tanks that morning. The attack stalled. German after-action reports noted, with visible confusion, that American artillery had been, in their precise phrasing, extremely effective. The coordination was unexpected. The timing was not what they had experienced before. This was the first significant demonstration of what American artillery could do when the system worked as designed. It would not be the last. By the time American forces landed in Normandy, on June 6, 1944, the artillery system had been refined through a year of combat in North Africa and Italy. The fire direction centers had become faster. The communication networks had been hardened. Crews had fired thousands of real missions. The doctrine was no longer theoretical. It was instinct. What German soldiers encountered in the hedgerow country of Normandy's bocage began to appear in their letters home, in terms that mixed professional analysis with something closer to dread. The problem wasn't just that American artillery was accurate. German artillery was accurate too. The problem was the simultaneity. A German veteran could manage incoming fire the way he'd been trained, read the pattern, move between rounds, use the ground. But time on target removed the pattern entirely. There was no gap to move into. There was no sequence to read. The entire zone simply became lethal, all at once. One German prisoner, captured by American forces in the summer of 1944 and debriefed by intelligence officers, described the experience this way. He said his unit had been moving along a road when the American artillery struck. He said it felt like the road itself had exploded, not like something had landed on the road, but like the road had detonated from underneath. Several of his men were gone before he understood that shells had even arrived. He wasn't describing a particularly large fire mission. He was describing a coordinated time-on-target strike from a handful of batteries. German intelligence tried to work out how the Americans were doing it. The technical explanation wasn't completely beyond reach. The concept of simultaneous impact wasn't a mystery once you thought through the math. What German analysts struggled with was the reliable, repeatable execution. Their own artillery arm was excellent, but it was built around a different philosophy. German artillery commanders had significant autonomy. Batteries often operated more independently. The centralized, networked, mathematically synchronized approach the Americans had built required a level of standardization and communication infrastructure that German doctrine simply hadn't prioritized in the same way. There's an irony here that the Germans themselves occasionally noted. German engineering throughout the war trended toward complexity and specialization. Their tanks were sophisticated, often superior in individual capability to their Allied counterparts, but difficult to maintain and impossible to produce in sufficient numbers. Their artillery pieces were formidable, but the German military mind, shaped by a tradition that prized the initiative of individual commanders, what they called Auftragstaktik, or mission-type tactics, had produced a force that was brilliant at improvisation and poor at the kind of rigid, synchronized precision that time on target demanded. The Americans had built the opposite. Their equipment was often simpler. Their doctrine was more standardized. But that standardization meant a fire direction center in Normandy, a fire direction center in Italy, and a fire direction center in the Pacific were all running the same calculations the same way, and every gun crew had trained to the same stopwatch standard. This is what German soldiers were trying to describe in their letters home. They weren't just saying the Americans had a lot of artillery, though the Americans absolutely had a staggering amount of it. They were trying to describe something qualitatively different, something that broke the normal logic of how artillery worked. The scale of American artillery production during the war makes the numbers almost difficult to absorb. The United States produced over 600,000 artillery pieces of various calibers during the conflict. American forces in the European theater fired hundreds of millions of artillery rounds. In the last year of the war, American artillery units were firing missions at a pace that exhausted German counter-battery efforts entirely. But volume alone wasn't the story. The story was that every round was being used as part of a coordinated system. Forward observers, many of them moving with infantry or calling in fires from light aircraft, could reach a fire direction center and have shells on target within minutes. By 1944 and 1945, experienced American artillery teams were achieving time-on-target coordination across multiple battalions, dozens of guns, with flight time calculations done by hand on standardized forms, at speed. German forward units began reporting a tactical adaptation they hadn't needed to develop against other enemies. When American artillery shifted toward a position, experienced German soldiers had learned not to scatter, because movement was visible, and because the follow-on rounds would come before they could clear the danger zone. Instead, they went flat and still, and hoped the first strike had been all of it. It often wasn't. American observers, watching from forward positions, or from the small liaison aircraft that became one of the most effective tools of the campaign, would call adjustments and then request a second mission. The Fire Direction Center would run new numbers, and the guns would fire again, time to arrive together. German unit commanders wrote to their divisional headquarters, asking for guidance on how to position their forces to reduce artillery vulnerability. The answers that came back were largely unsatisfying, because the honest answer was that there wasn't a good solution. You could disperse your forces to reduce the casualties from any single strike, but dispersion reduced your combat power. You could move at night, but American observers had learned to anticipate movement patterns and pre-register roads and likely routes. You could try to suppress the forward observers, but they were integrated with infantry and protected. The letters home from ordinary German soldiers weren't written in doctrinal language. They didn't reference fire direction centers, or time-on-target calculations. They described what they experienced. They described the ground shaking in ways that felt wrong. They described the silence after a strike, a particular kind of silence, they wrote, where nobody spoke for a moment, because nobody could fully believe what had just happened. They described veterans, men who had fought in Poland and France and the Soviet Union, going quiet in ways that worried the men around them. They wrote about the unpredictability of it. German soldiers had a word for what effective artillery could do to a man's nerves over time. They understood the phenomenon well, because they had inflicted it on enemies themselves. But the American version had a specific quality that their previous combat experience hadn't prepared them for. It didn't crescendo, it didn't escalate, it simply arrived, all of it, at once. One German officer's letter, recovered after the war, and cited in several historical accounts of the campaign, described watching an American time-on-target strike land on a German assembly area across a valley. He wrote that he had been an artilleryman himself before transferring to infantry. He understood guns. He had a professional's eye for fire. He wrote that what he saw was not something he could have ordered his own batteries to execute with the same precision. He wrote that the Americans had solved a problem he had considered unsolvable in combat conditions. He wrote that it was, in his word, unnerving. And this was a man who had survived years of war on the Eastern Front. By late 1944, captured German officers being debriefed by Allied intelligence were raising the artillery question consistently. They weren't asking about American tanks, which they often still considered inferior to their own. They weren't asking about American aircraft, though the fighter-bomber threat was significant. The question that kept surfacing was about the artillery coordination. How was it being done? How was the communication network staying intact under counter-battery fire? How were the calculations being completed so quickly? The American officers doing the debriefing sometimes found this almost difficult to explain, simply because the system's sophistication was embedded in training and infrastructure that had been built over years. There was no single secret. There was no captured document that would unlock the method. It was doctrine, standardization, training, communication, mathematics, and crews who had internalized the stopwatch discipline to the point where it was automatic. That combination, doctrine married to industrial scale, married to communication infrastructure, married to the willingness to standardize rather than improvise, was something the German military had never fully built, and by 1944, it could no longer build it. The weapon German soldiers couldn't explain wasn't a specific gun. It wasn't a new technology. It was a system. It was the idea that you could take artillery, which every army had, and transform it, through coordination and mathematics, into something that eliminated the soldier's most basic survival instinct, the instinct to move when the shells start falling. Time on Target said, "There is no moment to move into. There is only the moment when everything arrives." The German soldiers who wrote those letters home understood that something had changed in how wars were fought. They didn't have the language to describe fire direction doctrine or ballistic synchronization, but they knew what it felt like to be on the receiving end of a system designed with one purpose. They just couldn't explain how the Americans had built it. Subscribe to WWII Dark Legacy.